Hello and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Kevin Kniese, Chief Technology Officer at Symmetry, and today we're going to be talking about moving to SAP HANA and some of the things you'll probably want to know. Before we get into the webinar, I want to be sure to invite everyone to join us for a follow-up session on February 4th. This will be a live panel discussion where Jim Licano from HP and myself will be discussing and hopefully answering all your questions about getting to HANA. All attendees will also receive an actual deployment guide to help facilitate the process of getting there. And now on to the presentation. At a high level, we'll be talking about the multiple scenarios available for deploying HANA. We'll talk about the migration path if you already have SAP products that you want to migrate to HANA. We'll talk a little bit about costs and do some analysis around that and point out the various ways to save money and be cost-effective, take cost-effective measures to get to HANA. And then we'll throw in some security measures that are particularly relevant for on-premise as well as cloud solutions. With a little bit more detail, here's the topics in the order that we'll be covering. We'll start off with why HANA. Why SAP HANA? It's not just because Hasso says so. SAP has been listening to their customers for years talk about better performance and performance demands. Back in 2010, Hasso identified the solution to those demands as being an in-memory database. Today, multiple customers are running SAP on HANA, and HANA has tremendous support. Some of the biggest benefits of running HANA are that it's tremendously flexible. It can receive and process data from multiple data sources. They can be SAP as well as non-SAP systems. It can be used for transactional systems as well as analytic systems. And it really allows you to make better, faster decisions because you're basing those decisions on real-time information. Also, as SAP continues to move forward, development is really focused on SAP HANA, and so some functionality in the future may only be available if you're actually running on a HANA system. And now we're going to move on to the next topic, which is information about the technical requirements for running SAP HANA. As I mentioned earlier, SAP HANA has been around for quite a while now. And because of that, there's tons and tons of OSS notes out there. These notes are always a good idea to review when you're making plans to move to HANA. There's also deployment guides and migration guides that help facilitate the process, as well as pictorial roadmaps that help identify what versions of things you might need to be on if you're planning to move to SAP HANA. Here's an example of one of the roadmaps available from SAP. It identifies several different topics here, things like the kernel levels and the methodology that you might use in order to get from point A to point B. It includes whether you're using SWPM or if you're using some methodology. The roadmap that you'll need to follow will vary somewhat depending on what use case you have planned for your SAP HANA deployment. A primary persistent system will certainly have different technical requirements than a data mart or maybe a sidecar. There's also multiple other use cases for SAP HANA that will also impact the technical requirements needed. Sizing is critical to your SAP HANA environment in order to achieve performance goals. Depending on what type of system you plan to deploy on HANA, there will be differences between CPU, memory, and disk. Generally, a good rule of thumb is the more memory you require for your system, the more CPU cores you'll also require. There's a couple of different ways to size your environment. If you're planning a migration, maybe the quickest way to determine what size system you need is basically to use the following formulas. So for memory, you roughly take the size of your current database, cut that in half, add 20% to it, and then add another 50 gigs to it. For disk, similar formula. You take your database size, you add additional, the two largest tables to it, you divide that in a quarter, you add 20% to that, and then another 25 gigs on top of that. And likewise for CPU, generally you calculate about 3 times the factor of what you're using today. So for database processing, if you're using 4 CPUs, then you'll probably need something like 12 CPU cores. Other ways to size your environment include, of course, the SAP Quick Sizer. There's also a t-shirt sizing methodology wrapped around SAP HANA Systems for HANA come in 64 gigs all the way up through 1 terabytes and sometimes bigger. They can even come up as scale up to 6 terabytes or as big as 12 terabytes. And certainly the scale up methodology will allow you for several terabytes. Regardless of which way you decide to size your system, it's always important to keep in mind that to truly achieve the performance goals, you must meet the KPI requirements that SAP delivers. And also, when you're sizing your environment, it's important to consider growth. Just like your SAP system grows on your current on-disk database, it's also going to grow an in-memory database. We'll return to the sizing exercise a little bit later in this presentation, but for now we'll continue on with additional requirements for deploying SAP HANA. It's important to note that there's specific certified hardware that it's designed to run on, that a certified installer will be required for the OS and for the HANA database, likewise for the SAP application. Bottom line is it's really all about the KPI programs and meeting those in order to be certified and have SAP comfortable with supporting your environment. Also, HANA is capable of being virtualized, so that's important to know. We'll also talk more about that down the road. Really, the bottom line is certified everything. It's important for your versions, if you're migrating to HANA, that you're at the proper levels. And the system type is certainly going to make a difference depending on whether you're on Suite, BW, or any of the other products on HANA. And now on to some more details about deploying HANA. There's multiple options, and we're going to talk about those next. Of course, the first of the options is whether to deploy on-premise or in the cloud. Certainly both are possible, and the differences will be discussed later, both financially as well as some of the comparison on timelines and things like that. But in general, if you decide to deploy on-premise, it's important that you have a staff that's got some extensive SAP expertise. You probably have to go out and get some certifications and things, and certainly sizing is a critical step here, because as your system grows, you don't want to be in a situation where you need to buy another appliance. In the cloud, however, you basically just have to buy the resources and have them made available to deploy a system on. Certainly the KPIs come into play here again. All those need to be validated. And ultimately, the nice part about deploying in the cloud is that it's the option of growing as you need. You only buy the resources you need today, and then as you grow, you can deploy onto a larger system down the road. Whether you're planning to deploy HANA on-premise or in the cloud, multiple options are available to you. So from the standpoint of deploying HANA, you can deploy a single application against a single HANA environment. You can do the same multiple applications against a single HANA environment, or multiple HANA systems on a single host. We're not going to talk much about multi-tenancy, as that's not going to be a recommendation. And certainly, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud, virtualization will be a factor. Moving on to the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about migrating to SAP HANA. It's probably one of the most common questions that I receive is, what is the process like? So we're going to talk a little bit about that next. The answer that I give when asked about what the process of migrating to HANA is like is usually it's just pretty much the same or similar to what a step from any other OSDB migration might look like. It's important to establish a project plan, and certainly you want to remember the roadmap that SAP laid out. So you want to make sure you include things like your product version, your kernel version, and the overall stream you're going to follow, whether it's SWPM or SUM version. To highlight the process of migrating to SAP HANA a little bit more, here's what a project flow might look like. Very much is going to be the same as what you do for any other OSDB migration, with a couple of different variations, and I'll point those out within this slide. So of course, acquiring the new hardware, acquiring the software, so SAP software, database software, that whole thing. Deploy that hardware. Might have a little bit of a variation there because you are going to need to have some certified personnel deploy that, but there's people out there available to process that function. And then move on to creating a sandbox. It's always a good idea to do a demonstration system, a preliminary system in order to visualize what you're going to actually end up with and correct any or make any adjustments that are required within the process overall. Then move on to deploying QA and dev, not necessarily in that order, whichever your project plan calls for, and then create your production system. After you've gone live, it goes into ongoing maintenance, and the big difference here is you get to reap the benefits of all that processing and performance power and availability of real-time data. Next to questions around the migration process, I often get questions about what the investment model will look like. So in this next section, we'll just have a couple of topics around the similarities and differences to what an investment in HANA, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud, might look like. Then we'll move on later and do an actual example where we use some real numbers in order to do some calculations. So to do a little bit of a comparison between deploying HANA on-premise or in the cloud, we'll point out these similarities and differences. From the technical requirements perspective, the deployment options and the methodology of migration or deployment, pretty much all the same whether you're on-premise or in the cloud. Differences, however, include things that may help shorten timeline and certainly reduce risk. The biggest point there is that you can deploy HANA, get an example, do a proof of concept without making a large equipment investment. Likewise, you have the option to grow. Start small and grow as your requirements grow. So kind of pay-as-you-grow model. If you're concerned about deploying HANA in the cloud, here's some statistics that may help ease that concern. These statistics are from market analysis organizations and point out the stability and the growth of the cloud as a market segment. And now on to the fun part, an actual example showing the comparison of what an investment might look like in the cloud versus on-premise. The example we're using here is from an actual customer that we migrated a few months back. The size of their environments are listed here. They're about 1.2 terabytes in size. Their dev system was a bit smaller. They are using Suite on HANA. And so because this is a migration, we went ahead and we used the calculations shown earlier in this presentation in order to figure out what the sizes will look like when the system is migrated to HANA. So we went from basically 1.2 terabytes down to about 770 gigs of required memory, which translated into 770 gigs of memory. Their disk requirement went from quite a bit down to 439 gigs, and their CPU cores for the database processing went from 4 cores up to 12 cores. When we were talking to this particular customer, we were asked to build out an example environment for them. They were wanting to determine whether they should deploy on-premise or in the cloud. So we communicated with multiple hardware providers, and then kind of averaged out what the size of each of the individual environments would look like. So as we deployed 2 different systems. One was exclusively used for production, and that system was about $195,000. The system for dev and Q we actually virtualized, and that system was a little bit bigger, 1.5 terabytes in size, and it came out to about $271,000. So the total investment was just under $500,000. Then from the standpoint of the time required to get the equipment on site, to get it stood up, get it operational, first segment was about 45 days to get the equipment built, assembled at the factory, and then shipped over to the customer, and then about 2 to 4 weeks for the actual break-in and configuration, patching, and all that was required on the customer's floor. The same was true for the ECQ and ECD systems. So they went through the same process. Those systems were actually delivered pretty much in the same day, but ultimately had specific requirements depending on the individual that was sent, or the group that was sent to actually do the on-premise deployment. From there we went on to do the actual deployments of HANA and SAP. So We started off with the sandbox and deployed the database, then followed and deployed SAP on top of SAP HANA, and the investments look like this here. In the next slide, rather than show each sandbox, dev, queue, and prod, I'm going to consolidate them into a single chart, and we'll show you that next. So here's the chart that shows the estimates for doing a sandbox and then dev, queue, and prod. So because we're trying to facilitate and help the customer understand what the investment might look like and the timeline might look like for the project, we built out costs associated to each step of the way, as well as the timeline, the days, the number of days. And roughly the estimate came out to about $671,000 for an on-premise deployment of HANA, and the timeline was quite a long timeline, about 207 days. Because we were doing a comparison of what an on-premise HANA deployment versus a cloud HANA deployment would look like, I threw in a few more statistics about drivers for migrating to the cloud. And certainly the biggest one there is the 5% reduction and how much money it could potentially save a business. And certainly companies are always trying to do more with less. Then we went on to do the same evaluation and estimate for doing the deployment of HANA in the cloud. And ultimately we started off with the same exact calculations, so here they are in this chart, and we'll move on to some of the evaluations and analysis for dollars and cents here in a second. When demonstrating areas for cost savings to the customer, we took the exact same resource allocations that we had from the previous slide and an on-premise solution and put them into the cloud in a virtualized environment. So in this case, production is virtualized as well as QA and dev, so all three are virtualized. And there's no expenses, no cost to get started. Likewise, there was a moderately reduced deployment exercise because the hardware is already stood up and ready to go in the data centers. From the standpoint of the migration costs, they're pretty much the same as the same certified personnel will be used. For a few more details about shortening the timeline and how that actually takes place, in our data center, the systems are already deployed and have been tested with multiple different types of HANA solutions put on them, built around the KPIs, and so that the equipment is ready to go, so there's no wait time. And likewise, in doing our testing, building out HANA systems and tuning them and testing them, we have knowledge in advance of building up a new system for our customers. So the testing and the preparation that's done within the data center is definitely beneficial from the standpoint of the timeline. So here's the summary chart for deploying the same HANA environment in the cloud, and demonstrates not only how much time would be saved, but also the dollars that would be saved. It's important to note that these charts are built on a very specific, customer-specific and customer roadmap-specific deployment. And in this particular case, this is a worst-case scenario, and they still saved $200,000 and a significant amount of time for the overall project. Here was the decision-making slide that ultimately broke down exactly what was going to be saved for dollars, as well as what the project timeline would look like. In this particular case, the customer wanted to have a comparison on a monthly basis, even though the expense would end up being CapEx if they put it on premise. But I broke it down so that you could see that overall savings was $203,000 and 3 months of shorter timeline to get their HANA environment up and running. Based on the analysis in the previous slides, the customer made the decision to move their HANA environment into the cloud. Not only did they save in the overall expense, but they saved additional monies, as they did not have to pay for resources for QA, dev, or prod as Sandbox was going, like they would have if they would have purchased their own HANA environment on-premise. Likewise, we were able to shrink the size of their overall environment down, and they were comfortable with the fact that in the future, if they needed to grow their environment, they would be able to when the time was right. Now that the investment model had been demonstrated and the comparisons have been done, and the customer chose to move into the cloud, they wanted to talk a little bit more and understand more about security measures taken in the cloud. We'll demonstrate that next. When talking about security in the cloud, one of the first places to start is talking about the cloud in terms of public, private, or hybrid. In this particular case, we deployed the customer's HANA environment in a private cloud. In a sense, that's more of a managed hosting solution where the customer has complete private, dedicated MPLS networking as well as IPsec tunnel backups, but our team actually manages the resource allocation. This is particularly important for HANA environments as well as all SAP environments, as an adjustment in resources generally requires a restart of the SAP environment. We don't want that to happen, whether it's done by the customer or anyone else. The next thing to talk about with regard to security in the private cloud is the means by which the environment was built. The HANA environment was completely virtualized, so all systems are virtualized. Therefore, we're taking advantage of security that's built in by logical separation between all resources, and that's managed by the hypervisor. And again, as I manage, the Symmetry team will actually do the resource allocation and configuration of that portion of the environment. Here's a pictorial depiction of virtualization at work. Notice there's multiple customers divided by logical lines of separation controlled by the hypervisor. Each of those environments have separate dedicated connections, separate private connections for network purposes. And again, Symmetry's team manages and controls all resource allocation. Another topic with security implications was mentioned earlier in the presentation under the deployment options section. That has to do with HANA's ability to have multi-tenancy databases. In a private cloud, one of the advantages of the private cloud is that all customers are allocated private resources, whether they be virtual or physical. Networking and network configuration plays a critical role when systems are moved into the cloud. Here's an example of what a diagram might look like for a cloud environment. More specific details around network and network configuration include the following. All customers have their own private point-to-point network into our private cloud, whether that be MPLS, IPsec, other point-to-point type connections. Public IP addresses are available but generally have specific purpose and are not used unless the system is in a DMZ. From the internal perspective, all customers are on separate subnets, separated by VLANs. All subnets are firewalled between customers, and all subnets are also firewalled between the administrative network and the customer's systems. In addition to the security steps just outlined, SAP also publishes a best practices guide as well as multiple OSS notes that are rigorously followed and updated frequently. Additional security measures deployed within Symmetry's private cloud include restrictions to user access. Certainly the applications are available through normal means, the SAP GUI, what have you, but access to the OS level is generally restricted. Customers can define users or user groups that can have access, and generally those are named users and not root users. Root users are very much restricted and can be given access, but that's managed through a change management process and may affect SLAs if that user is given, if customer users are given root access. And certainly for the infrastructure, there is no access to administrative tools in that level. More about user access as it relates to SAP HANA security. Just like any other SAP environment, it's important to build role-based authorizations for your internal SAP users. These roles should be based on their business function and give them access to only the transactions they need to perform their duties. SAP also has additional security measures called content security that deal with permissions on files, on the software, and the SAP HANA database itself. Some of the OSS notes are listed here below. Here's a list of several other security measures provided by Symmetry's cloud. Content management, two-factor authentication, endpoint protection, intrusion detection and protection, penetration testing, security information and event management, as well as encryption. All of these should be provided by any cloud provider, and it's important to ask to find out what they're using in order to provide this as a service. And now just a few more bullet points before I close. If you're considering a move to SAP HANA, it's recommended that you perform a proof of concept first. This will give you the opportunity to visualize the performance of your environment before making a significant financial investment. Also, if you're considering moving into the cloud, it's recommended that you select a private cloud provider. This will give you ensured private resource allocations, shortened timelines, and avail your environment to all of the security measures discussed throughout this presentation. Closing, here's a location where you can find additional information. Also, I'd like to thank everyone for participating and encourage you to join us for our live session on February 4th.